Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer was a murderer who appeared to kill not only for the thrill of the kill but also for the publicity that would follow. In the end, it was all just a game of catch me if you can, and he seemed to enjoy the anxiety he instilled in the police. He would write in-depth letters to both the police and the media, providing them with information about the killers that only he would know. He also made fun of the police by sending letters containing codes that, if deciphered, would reveal his identity. The shooting deaths of two teens in December in Beania's Lover's Lane marked the beginning of the Zodiac's activities. In spite of a thorough investigation and hundreds of possible suspects, he claimed several more victims over the course of the following year, taunting authorities with messages he would select young couples in peaceful settings as victims. He meticulously planned these actions to ensure he got as much attention as possible to attract the police. Although the Zodiac Killer was never identified, his letters claimed to have killed up to 37 people, but investigators could only connect him to 5 confirmed killings. The only evidence of the killer's identity was DNA, which pointed to many individuals. The Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy played Pogo the Clown at neighborhood gatherings and charity functions, but behind closed doors, he was a mass murderer who killed 33 young men in his Norwood Park Township, Illinois, home between 1976 and 1978. Gacy recruited at least 33 boys and men to his house by posting job openings in public places. Once inside, he would kill them by strangling or suffocating them until their deaths. Gacy's killing spree came to an end in 1978. Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder in 1980 and given the death penalty. This was after the police found a significant number of human remains buried in the crawl space of his home and the surrounding area. The investigation also revealed that Gacy had been meticulously documenting his crimes in journals and keeping motorcycles from his victims. It was said that this had brought him great happiness. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was perceived, like many other serial killers, as a charming and charismatic man. He would almost always use this quality to win over the trust of the next victim. Bundy was good at talking and came across as nice, which made people trust him. This was a ruse to make it easier for him to find a victim. Over the course of the next 4 years, he would commit over 30 murders without anyone ever suspecting a thing. This occurred between 1974 and 1978. Bundy began a multi-state killing spree, mainly focusing on young women and girls. He would entice his victims by assuming the role of an authority figure or by acting as though he needed assistance. By doing so, he would make himself appear less dangerous and give him the chance to approach his vehicle, where he would then brutally murder them. Bundy frequently returns to the crime places to commit acts of necrophilia, which makes his killing techniques especially brutal. Even worse, even though he would commit these murders nearly routinely, he would decapitate at least 12 of his victims and preserve their severed heads to remember them. Even though Bundy was a mass murderer, his ability to fit in with society allowed him to elude arrest for years. During his final trial in Florida, he appeared to be a normal guy who dated women, had a job, and wasn't socially awkward. After hiring his own attorney, Bundy tried to paint himself as a victim of corny jokes and a broken family, but the overwhelming evidence pointed to his guilt and his eventual execution sentence. Milwaukee Cannibal. From necrophilia's cannibalism and the long-term preservation of his victims' body parts, if it weren't for one victim who managed to escape, Jeffrey Dahmer would have gotten away with murdering his victims. Usually, Dahmer would entice men, mainly young African-American men and boys, back to his apartment, where he would inject drugs into their drinks and then do whatever he pleased with them once his victims were dead. He was found guilty of killing 15 men and boys. He would dismember their bodies and keep various body parts, such as skulls, hands, and genitalia, with him. He would even eat some of the body parts. He tried various experiments on some victims, thinking that by using a drill and harmful chemicals, they would become zombie-like for eternity. Even though he admitted to more killings, the worst part may have been that fewer murders may have occurred because one of his victims, a young boy from Louisiana, managed to escape from his home despite D having drilled a hole in his skull. The police then returned to D's residence because Jeffrey would later lie and claim that Dahmer was his drunk boyfriend. Dahmer was eventually apprehended in 1991 and given a life sentence, but he would later pass away from being beaten to death by another prisoner. Jack the Ripper. While Jack the Ripper's death toll wasn't as high as that of other serial killers, he did accomplish one thing that the others couldn't: he managed to escape. The murders occurred in the impoverished Whitechapel district of London in 1888, and the victims were likely elderly prostitutes who he paid for their services but were unaware that they had been paid to die. In contrast to today, when such killings would be widely publicized on social media or in the news, everyone was forced to rely on the news or hearsay, which made matters worse. Newspapers would describe how the Ripper would carefully remove his victims' internal organs while leaving everything intact at the time that education on topics like human anatomy was only available to the wealthiest members of society. As a result, the public believed they were dealing with not only a murderer but also someone who was intelligent and possibly quite wealthy. In 1888, after the first body was discovered, more bodies kept turning up. You can only imagine the fear everyone felt at the time due to rumors that he might also be a vampire. The majority of the victims were impoverished prostitutes who were forced into prostitution in order to make ends meet. At the time, the authorities believed they had it coming and provided them with little protection. However, despite the intense investigation at the time and the numerous suspects that have been put forth over the years, Jack the Ripper's identity is still one of the greatest mysteries to this day. Charles Manson. Essentially a cult leader, Manson established the Manson family commune in the late 1960s. His charismatic personality and ideals attracted a devoted following of mostly young women. He preached a darker philosophy that involved inciting a race war he called Helter Skelter, with the goal of killing celebrities and blaming it on specific black gangs. In August 1969, members of Manson's cult killed actress Sharon Tate, who was pregnant, at her Los Angeles home. The couple Leno and Rosemary Lunca were killed the next night in their home, and at both crime scenes, messages written in blood read, "Death to pigs, pigs," referring to the police officers. This was done to give the impression that the murders were carried out by gangs, but in reality, Manson didn't even physically commit the murders. Instead, he tricked his followers into carrying out the acts on his behalf. Manson was given the death penalty after being found guilty of plotting to commit murder. However, the sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. The Butcher of Plainfield. After his mother passed away in 1945, Ed Gein lived a solitary life on their family farm in the small Wisconsin town of Plainfield. His already unstable mental state worsened, sending him down a dark path of necrophilia, grave robbery, and eventually murder in 1957 when local authorities searching for a missing woman had to search his property. The quiet farmer's house turned out to be one of the worst things in murder history. Gein had made clothing and household items from human skin and body parts. Gein's bizarre obsession with his deceased mother led to the removal of multiple corpses from local graveyards and their preservation. This obsession eventually resulted in the murder of 2 women, whose bodies were discovered on his property, dismembered and mutilated. Gein was eventually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and declared legally insane, but his crimes were still so horrific that horror films like Psycho and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre were based on his story. The Night Stalker. Through June 1984, a string of home invasions and murders would take place throughout California. The murderer's particularly heinous tactics included breaking into homes late at night, beating and assaulting his victims, and frequently performing satanic rituals before killing them. The police may have been dealing with a lunatic who was searching for his victims every night. He was known to leave satanic symbols at crime scenes, which led to the moniker Night Stalker. His crimes included extreme violence, sadism, and a lack of empathy or regret for his victims. It was discovered that some of the victims' bodies had been subjected to protracted acts of torture. In August 1985, the hunt for the Night Stalker became one of the largest manhunts in California history, with over 200 detectives working the case. The killer was identified and beaten by a group of East Los Angeles residents before being arrested, and with that Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had been caught during his trial. Ramirez embraced his Night Stalker persona, often flashing a pentagram to the cameras and taunting the families of his victims. It was pretty clear that the killers simply enjoyed torture. Even more ridiculous is the fact that Phyllis Singleter, a juror in Richard Ramirez's 1989 trial, suddenly passed dead. When Away Singleter was discovered dead in her apartment, it was determined that she had taken a fatal combination of alcohol and prescription medications, particularly Valium and the painkiller codeine. Because Single's death happened during Ramirez's trial's penalty phase, many people believed that Ramirez was to blame for the death. As a result, Ramirez was found guilty of 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and 14 burglaries. The Rostov Ripper. At least 53 women and children in the Russian towns of Rostov Shukty and Novcharas between 1973 and 1990 were murdered by the Rostov Ripper, in part because of the investigators' inexperience and the absence of contemporary forensic tools at the time. His victims were between the ages of 7 and 36, and following the killings, he would frequently commit acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. Andrei Chikatilo preyed on defenseless people by taking advantage of their trust or desperation. He would frequently approach his victims in public settings like bus or train stations, markets, or parks, offering them money, food, or assistance. By projecting an image of kindness and helpfulness, he won his victims' trust and led them to isolated areas where he could carry out his heinous acts without being noticed. Chikatilo would also guarantee aid or financial support to women who were in need of help or struggling financially, actually in the Soviet Union. Chikatilo remained at large for more than 10 years until his killing spree came to an end in 1990 when he was arrested after a routine document check revealed his connection to the murders. The 1980s were a terrible time to live, and the victims were desperate, so he would do this before subjecting them to violent acts, such as biting off their tongues and other body parts. Shimo eventually admitted to the killings during his trial and gave a graphic account of the enjoyment he took from the violent and deformative activities. In 1994, he was convicted guilty of 52 murders and given a firing squad execution sentence. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel for more enthusiastic content.